Hello, good morning, everybody. We are very grateful for your presence in this last session of the seminar on youth gangs from a comparative international perspective. For this session, we are pleased to have Nathanial Roloff, who will talk to us about the case of Cape Town. Nathaniel Roloff has been working on the issue of gangs for 17 years. His early career in education instigated a passion for youth rights and obligations. He earned his first MA in human rights, focusing on the rights of the child in conflict situations. His second MA in conflict resolution was focused primarily on gang violence and mediation strategy. He spent 5 years at the Georgetown Center for Social Justice as a program director working on community development and education in Washington, D.C.'s highest violence ward. In regard to gangs specifically, Nathanial spent his research efforts on comparing the conditions of child soldiers to gang participation in Latin America countries, as well as working on international comparisons of gang positioning within society, origin stories, and reason for operation. He began working independently in South Africa on research about gang typology, policy, and interventions in South Africa, before taking over at the Safety Lab as the executive director, making gang research and intervention a pillar of their work. He has been working in South Africa across government, public, and private sectors to build solutions to gang and youth violence for the last 10 years. Thank you very much. Nathaniel, we will now pass you the floor. So go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone who is on this call. And I apologize that I am the only native English speaker and not any longer proficient in Spanish, as I've been in Africa for too long. And otherwise I would embarrass myself and try to speak Spanish for everyone, which would probably be worse. I'm going to try to speak to what I encountered in South Africa when I first came here, and the sort of difference in terms of the way gangs operate and their the components that sort of make up their characteristics. Unlike most places that I've been, the gangs in Cape Town in particular are different from what you experience in the rest of South Africa. And because it's such a segregated ethnic space in Cape Town, we have gangs that operate very differently than one another, coexisting in the same city and sort of overlapping in terms of their operations, as well as at times their membership profiles. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that characteristic in Cape Town and explain as best I can what those characteristics are and what makes that a bit different when it comes to our interaction with doing violence interruption and gang intervention work here. I'm going to share a presentation. It is on Prezi. If there is anyone that sort of starts to feel a bit of vertigo or anything, I can try to switch the presentation up a bit. And I'm going to share a document, and I'll also share these with the hosts so that if you guys would like to look at them on your own at any point, you can carry on and sort of take a look at those later on. So the first part I'm going to share is my presentation, which is sort of a fluid one. And so if it makes anybody sort of feel a little bit uncomfortable, please let me know. Let me know if it is visible. Everyone have it? All right. So this is a presentation that I put together for a lot of the state actors here originally that didn't know how to differentiate the violence that they were experiencing from one community to another. We have 5 distinct types of gangs in Cape Town. And part of that breaks down on racial lines. And part of that breaks down on age lines. And so we've got these sort of different operational modes that I want to talk about. But I'm going to be speaking about gangs in the Western Cape. So the Western Cape is the state in which, or the province in our case, in which Cape Town exists. Although Cape Town is by far the largest metropolitan area in the Western Cape, there are 8 different provinces in South Africa, and each having their own issues around this. South Africa views gangs as a Cape Town specific problem. If you take a look at their statistics and you take a look at the other reporting that the police do, they don't acknowledge gang behavior very much outside of Cape Town. That isn't truly accurate on the ground, but it's the sort of policy of the police here to focus their understanding and efforts of gangs on the Cape Town arena. And so this is a map of Cape Town. It doesn't give you a sense of scale, but we are now about 5 million people in Cape Town as of our most recent estimates. It's a very fast growing space. Where you see the words Cape Town over here, that is what you consider the primary central business district of Cape Town. And that is what you would see in pictures of Cape Town and what you see behind me here, that is the city center. But the city center is isolated from much of the rest of the city. And the rest of the city was created as a function of the apartheid regime spreading people of color out into other areas of the city. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what influence that had on gang development. But those policies carried on all the way into the 90s. So during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the national government started moving people of color out of areas along this mountain range you see here, along this that is next to the mountain behind me, into areas beyond this boundary here, where you see my little embedded image here, which I'm going to talk about later, as well as the other townships out here. And so they call them townships and Cape Flats. The Cape Flats are designated for what South Africans call the colored community, which is a particular group of people that are native to South Africa that are lighter skinned. And then the townships are what they call the areas that they migrated and segregated the Black community in. So I tried to create a taxonomy of gangs so people could understand what kind of gangs they were talking about when they'd hear about violence in the media. And so we created 4 different types that you will see in the streets. Some of these titles are titles you would see internationally. And I did my best to try to apply titles to the different types of gangs, even though they don't refer to them in these titles right now, with some exception. So we have different types of gangs. We've got crews, and they're sort of a disorganized group. They're not as oriented around hierarchy. They do operate under a name. They do operate oftentimes in very high violence kind of frameworks, but they don't necessarily have an economic outcome. A lot of their behavior is focused on trying to become sort of somebody that is acknowledged as potentially violent or capable of violence. And so these crews sometimes are the most public and visible forms of violence in Black areas. They're groups of usually 16 to 20-year-olds that are not yet in the sort of system, not yet a part of society in a working sense, and have been kind of left out. And they can sometimes be the majority of youth in a township at times. And so there are other gangs around the world that kind of operate like this. But they're largely famous because of the amount of visibility they have. They're in the streets. They're often sort of standing on street corners. They're often participating in some sort of drugs or low-level robbery of people. And they don't have a sort of structural economy to them. They don't try to make money in a particular way. Then we have a bigger group, mob crews. Now, the reason that they're different is because they have enough organization and enough branding behind them around their names, around their iconography, to exist in multiple areas across the city simultaneously. So at the same time, you'll have these youth gangs operating in one township and another township far away. And they are also high visibility, and oftentimes massive groups of people would come together to participate in violence. Mostly the conflicts they have are interpersonal that then become a part of a broader group violence issue. They might involve themselves in sort of a lot of knife and stone throwing, and there's a lot of stabbing that happens amongst these gangs. Here and there, these gangs, not often, but sometimes will get a hold of weapons, firearms, and they will participate in shootings and sometimes a very quick and broad-based rifling of shootings. And so then they make a lot of headlines. They get a lot of media attention. And more often than not, people aren't willing to acknowledge their particular influence on the community because they're still somebody's child, usually living at home, and parents are very protective of their children's involvement. And because of their violence is usually in a mob of people, like a large group, oftentimes there won't be anybody to hold accountable all on their own, and everyone is sort of diffusing blame. And so both of these types of gangs are principally in the Black township space. The crews that I mentioned earlier, some of them do exist in the Cape Flats, or what South Africans call the colored areas. But they are usually trying to earn their way into a gang, which is what I'm going to talk about now. Let me take a moment and find out from my organizers if everything I'm saying is at the right pace and if everyone's able to follow along with my presentation so far.
Yes, Nate, I would just add, it would be good for the Mexican and Latin American audience to have a short explanation of the difference between Black and colored. Because
so a little bit more of that, yeah.
Yeah, and also what the Safety Lab is, because Ismail said you are the executive director of the Safety Lab, but people here will not know what it is.
Absolutely. So I'm going to switch back to my, I'm going to pause my sharing and see if that works for a minute and come back to it. Can you guys see me again? Great. So in South Africa, the sort of very famous apartheid regime classified people into racial categories, I guess like every other nation does, but what they did differently than most countries at that time was create entirely different social, political, and service structures for each of those groups. And so the four principal groups that they divided everyone into was Black African, Colored African, Asian, which included the subcontinent of India and other countries sort of associated with the Indian subcontinent, and then white. Sort of bizarrely, the Japanese, for example, were considered part of the white class, and Chinese were placed in the Black group. Now, each of these groups were given different access to services, given different areas that they were allowed to live, and then forcibly removed and put in those areas with an entirely different structure around schooling, around housing, around the sorts of services that would be present in the space. The Black community got the least. So Black Africans were given almost nothing at all, from roads to plumbing to other elements in the Cape Town structure. In some cases, they were just moved whole out as sort of unpaid slave workers into camps. And those are the furthest out from the city center of the neighborhoods that were built during apartheid. The colored community, which at least in America, we find as we sort of consider an offensive term, that here is a legal racial group. And it was first given to the first peoples of this region of South Africa. So that is the Khoi and the San people, two different sort of tribal groups. And they were lighter skinned and they had an entirely different sort of social structure to the Black African tribes that also existed in South Africa at the time. Over time, anybody that was involved in race mixing, so Black and white or Indian and Black, or any of those sorts of race mixing categories was then thrown into the same group as the colored group. And so they, more than any other culture, have been stripped of their sort of history and their identity. And they were forced, more so than the Black African groups, to speak Afrikaans, which was the official language of the country at the time. Afrikaans is like an old version of Dutch. And so there's two different distinct communities speaking Afrikaans in South Africa. One is the white Dutch rulers that were here at the time. And then the other group principally would be the colored group that speaks Afrikaans as their primary language. They also, like now in current South Africa, it's sort of a division between English and Afrikaans in that community. But in the Cape Flats, the communities I mentioned earlier, they speak almost exclusively Afrikaans as their home language. Now, they were given a little bit more services and a little bit more structure and allowed to have slightly better jobs in the apartheid regime. So they kind of created a gradient scale of color, white being the most privileged and Black being the least, that dictated what kind of jobs you were allowed to do, which areas of the city you were allowed to live in, what sort of education you received, and what sort of services you would get. And so that structure still exists in Cape Town today. Although there's no laws that promote it, there are no real policies that have undone that. So most people that live in the historically white areas are still white, and the same goes for colored and Black. And even in Cape Town, there's small communities that are just principally Asian, which in other cities in South Africa, there are bigger communities of Asian population, not as much in Cape Town. And so that is still a governing dynamic of the city. And that is partly what dictates these gang differentiations and the cultural difference in terms of the relationship to gangs. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and how this influenced the gang structures. But that is sort of still the way that Cape Town has divided itself. Does that help, Ignacio? Should I say anything more about that? All right. So let me try to return to my presentation. Let me know when this pops up for you. Are we in? Great. So now you'll come to sort of, we have a large amount of what we would think of as traditional gangs, the sort of gangs that are very popular in Latin and North America. That would be very organized with a tiered structure. There's a leadership structure in place. It can shift quickly depending on the neighborhood, but they've got leaders and sort of what I'd call generals. And then they've got sort of guys that are in the street, and then they have a lot of people doing various errands for them. These are most common, if not exclusive right now, to colored township spaces, the Cape Flats. They are highly economically driven. So they do any number of things in our city. Partly they provide protection services and extortion. They operate illegal sort of services from food distribution to taxis. And they participate obviously in the drug market in particular. The drug that has most recently been the most popular here is methamphetamine, meth, or what we call TIC. T-I-K is sort of the street name for it in South Africa. And then because of that and the other extortion stuff, it's a very territory-based conflict group. So the normal gang might have a little bit of a lower profile because they're not sort of always in the streets causing big public gang conflicts, but they are distributing and operating in the streets on a day-to-day basis around drug distribution and other things. And they have high impact crime. What I mean by that is a high level of mortality, often very violent, almost always involving guns, almost always involving shootouts. So this is the sort of gang that permeates all around the world, but in particular in our Cape Flats and colored township spaces. Now, lastly, I want to talk about a more broader organized gang that exists in our city. So we have some gangs that are just operating in one neighborhood and they don't share leadership with the gang, even by the same name, in another neighborhood. But then we have we have a number of gangs who do operate across the entire city and nationally, but that go by different names, and they have a structure and leadership and organization that allows them to make decisions and change the way they operate from one neighborhood to the next. Although there's obviously often conflict within those gangs because there's leadership moving up in different places at different times, they can do a lot more to get involved in importing guns, for example. They will make deals with drug importers more often. They're involved in the larger transnational crime syndicates. And so those are organizations of local gangs. And sometimes they'll take the same name, and sometimes they'll operate under what they call a flag or a banner. I'm not sure if it's ironic, but the two major sort of banners that they've chosen is the American flag, and the biggest gang in Cape Town is called the Americans. And they use a lot of, I'll show you later some of the icons, but they use a lot of American iconography to define them. The other bigger organized group of gangs is they call themselves the British. And so they organize themselves under the British flag, and they kind of acknowledge a generalized conflict with the Americans. So there's this sort of weird North American colonial battle going on in terms of the iconography and everything else. So these also operate almost exclusively in colored townships and flats. They have full business models at times, and many of their leaders are operating legitimate businesses in security, in sort of other manufacturing, and they will also involve themselves in ownership of clubs and other things. They also do a lot of territory management, and what I have here is real estate, just sort of how do we own and manage property across different areas of the city. And they participate in all the types of violence, from stabbing and robbery and hijacking through to drug distribution and the high violence murder rates that come with that. And so we kind of have an overlapping structure between all of these gangs. So the crews and the gangs, the mob crews, the organized gangs, they can all kind of feed into each other in different ways. For example, if you're a member of a crew or a mob crew, you might be trying to work your way up to a gang or an organized gang. And so at times, an organized gang might use any number of members from these other gangs, with the carrot, the sort of reward being, if you prove yourself, we might allow you into our bigger structure, our economic development framework. I'm going to try to skip through some of this because it would be otherwise a very long presentation. But what you see here is a sort of progression that would have to happen in order for somebody to move from the very most basic localized crew through to a bigger gang. And that I've just named some of the gangs. So the first one, Moscow, that's one of the local crews. The Vuras, that's more of a mob crew. They exist across the entire city. And then the Laughing Boys exist principally in the Cape Flats. So you wouldn't really see somebody move up in that way. We do have high functioning economic Black gangs. I call them the cliques, but they are not territory based. They are extortion and high level kind of economic crime oriented. They might hijack money trucks and steal that kind of stuff. They involve themselves in fraud often. And so the Vatos and Vuras or the Moscow, they would largely be trying to get those guys' attention. So I'm saying this very rarely happens where you would start at a very small crew and work your way up to an American, for example. So I'm going to skip some of this because I'm sure everyone is familiar with sort of why youth join gangs. You guys have been through multiple seminars on these things. What I was trying to pitch this for was more around the sort of governmental, what do we do now? But I need to talk about the number, which is the prison gang. It is the most famous gang in this country, and it is also the longest and oldest institution, longest running institution in South Africa. And when the early colonial regimes were imprisoning people in the mining era of South Africa, the prison gang called The Number was created. And within that, there are 3 micro gangs that are all members of The Number. And The Number has a sort of Bible. Ignacio knows quite a bit about it now, as he's spent some time with us and has heard many stories about it. But they have a book of myths, effectively, that sort of dictate their operations. And so The Number refer to 3 numbers, 26, 27, and 28. If you look up South African gangs, you are most likely going to find a lot more information on The Number. However, The Number as an organized prison gang doesn't usually function in the street very much. They have influence in the street, and some of the street gangs will take their name from The Number, or they will they'll associate themselves with one of those number gangs in prison. But the organization, the decision-making process, all of those things is pretty independent. And so these prison gangs and street gangs are largely separate. The prison number follows a very strict code, and they were used to organize the prisons when the colonial structure really wasn't interested in managing the prison quality or keeping it peaceful in any way. So they allowed self-governance through the number largely. And so they are very significant in that they create a whole nother level of influence within gangs in our country, and especially in the street. And a lot of our street gang members will opt their way into prison in order to get ranking in the prison number, even though that ranking doesn't translate directly into the street gang. And so these are blending more and more as we get into more and more modern society, as South Africa tries to better regulate its prisons, and the number have less and less power in the prison, but that gives them in some ways more and more interest in having power in the street. And so they have what we kind of colloquially in my company sort of refer to the prison number as sort of the university for gangs, because it is kind of seen as a matriculation opportunity, an opportunity for them to get a certificate proving their credibility. So, but the prison gang doesn't, as I said, often participate in the street behaviors. So this is an unfortunately low-res image, but what you see is a lot of the prison tattoos that people put onto people in prison here. They're very, there's a whole process around that. I won't bother you with it. And you don't have to have tattoos to demonstrate your rank in the prison gang, but it is a telltale sign of prison membership, in particular membership in the number. That has grown a little bit less popular, especially the face tattoos have kind of moved away, but we still have a lot of body tattoos, hands, arms, and so on. So here you see the sort of structural difference, colored township versus black township gangs. So in the colored township, they're larger, they're organized, they're dangerous. They account for a large proportion of our provincial and our city's murder rate every year. They date back to District 6. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with District 6, but District 6 is a neighborhood that was in Cape Town. It was a colored neighborhood, and it was one of the most famously profiled removals. So the government came in and removed everyone from this and other neighborhoods, but this one was very famous and concentrated and moved everyone out to the Cape Flats, about 15 kilometers away. So this move changed their operations substantially. It really hardened the gangs. So their original structures were a little bit more community focused, a little less murder oriented, much more sort of black market, various negative activities, but not as violent. And so now in the colored township, youth are nearly forced into gangs. So if you're in the Cape Flats in an area like Hanover Park, which I'll bring up later, you have a very few options but to be associated with a gang. There is very little option to move through the neighborhood without that association. It's very difficult to go to school. You might not have to participate, but you have to be associated. And if you're associated, you will end up with other risks, obviously. So gangs see rival gangs as effectively victims that they need to prove themselves with. So it's very difficult for somebody to get through high school in the Cape Flats without having some affiliation to a gang in the colored township. And then they create a social infrastructure. They create security, and they're the largest employer. So in a place like Hanover Park, they are the one that is most likely going to give somebody some work for some money, however small or large that may be. And so it's become sort of as though gangs are sort of an industry. The Cape Flats are sort of an industry town around gangs in many cases. Now, you're going to see that there's sort of these structures that flow into those gangs. So I mentioned that there was a huge hardening after the removals, and that housing and community structures play into this. Because of the territory, people prefer different gangs to be around them to provide them protection. And there are very few people that in the community don't experience some level of engagement or, I guess, protection from their gang, from other gangs. And this happened during that District 6 removal. And so here is an example of the sort of housing structures that were put up by the apartheid regime in the Cape Flats. So as opposed to the Black Township, where there is a lot of sort of informal housing, these are the sort of public housing units that were built, and they were built very densely, and they were built to sort of bring everybody into this very uniform housing structure, but they've been dilapidated over time. Very little repairs happen there. Very little community development has been sort of promoted there. And so we have a degeneration of both the infrastructure and of the community fabric that otherwise existed in District 6. So that's just a shot of them at night. And what you'll see is there's 2 buildings here in a row, but sometimes there's as many as 6 and 10 of these units in a row, depending on which neighborhood you're in. And so a lot of people are sort of pushed in on each other with no real green space, no real option for play outside of these highly dangerous zones, which might have gang conflicts within them. So I'm going to move through that part now. And this is one of the, another famous photo of some of the Americans showing off their guns and tattoos. You can see the American flag draped around one of the members in the back. So now if we move to Black Township spaces, they're usually not as big in terms of their territory, if they have territory. It's smaller, it's neighborhood based. The large mobs will have other groups that sort of influence them. They might have what we call cliques, the older black market participants that are sort of funding or instigating crime with them. And oftentimes what a shadow crew means to me is they're using these kids effectively as smoke screens for the real violence that goes on in the Black townships. So the Cape Flats are famous for their gang violence, but proportionately, the Cape Flats experience about half the per capita violence that Black townships do. So I'm going to try to repeat that just because I know we're getting mixed up in terms here, but the Cape Flats, which have the famous gangs, experience about half the violence of the Black township. But because they're so much more famous, because their iconography is so much better, because there's a structure to them, Cape Town tends to blame a lot of its violence on the Cape Flats gangs, when in reality, the Black townships experience far more violence, far more murder. And it is largely due to organized groups, but those organized groups don't always have the same name or the same iconography that the gangs in the Cape Flats have. And so these gangs stem back to pre-apartheid days in the sort of early, what they called native yards. So forgive me, but that's sort of the camp names that the old regime referred to Black settlements, native yards. And so in that period, there was a building of gang structures just as a sort of social organizational tool. And the youth joined these for safety, inclusion, even soccer teams. Some soccer teams become gangs over time. And then some are kind of forced into it as a function of needing to get to and from different places or needing to participate in this sort of behavior. We don't have the same sort of initiation process that a lot of other countries have. So in the American gangs, we have a lot of stories about initiation processes, which involve going out and committing crime, or you have to go arbitrarily hurt someone or go into battle against another gang. Those strict sort of structures of inclusion aren't very prevalent here. They are talked about here and there, but mostly it's an organic process of people choosing to participate in higher and higher degrees of violence and crime in order to prove themselves. It's not a strict rule in the gangs that you have to do anything that is sort of arbitrary or victimize someone in order to be a part of it. You are just welcomed as a function of their desire for numbers, and in this case, usually as a function of their locality, where they are and who lives around you. And so these are in the informal townships, and they have a tiered gang relationship. So older Black township gangs, I mean, in older in this case means both in age, but also in terms of the membership are older. They will operate in informal economies. And that means anything from selling different goods, especially black market goods, through to robbery, crime, fraud, and so on. And then the youth gangs are not connected to those economies at all. The youth gangs are principally organized for security of each other in opposition to the other gangs, as well as sort of a broader, I guess, identity framework and territory framework. So I'm going to pause again because I'm going through a lot of information, and I want to make sure I am talking about information in a way that everyone's grabbing onto. Are there questions or something I should stop? And can I also just get a time check on how much more time you guys would like me to spend on this presentation?
Yeah, you can take as much time as you need, Nate. And I think it's becoming very clear.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the Hanover Park scenario. So that's a great case study for us, partly because we were really involved in Hanover Park for some years. We are still again, but it is also one of the first of the Cape Flats areas that experienced the forced removal. And it has a large sort of brand in Cape Town, a large reputation for being a part of this gang operation. So it's a very low income space. Not much new economy has been developed there since the removals. And it's built around those housing developments I mentioned earlier. It has a history of what we call structural violence. That's government participating in overt violence against the community, forced removals from their homes, and then a heavy-handed policing structure that doesn't really work with the community at all. Sees them as needing to be policed and not policed on behalf of. They are Afrikaans and English speaking, and then there's a mixture of people that have been there since the beginning, and then there's a fair amount of new people coming and going in the community at all times. And so that is a street level look at the size of Hanover Park. And this is a fairly typical size of a neighborhood in Cape Town. So Hanover Park, if you look at this, it's about 1 kilometer wide by a little more than a half a kilometer north to south. And you can see all of the formal streets they have. There aren't that many. And it is intentionally created so that it's hard to get in and out of. So the apartheid regime would build these structures in a way that would only give you 3 or 4 exit opportunities in this square kilometer. So you can see, I'll hover with my mouse if you can see that. This is one of the roads that leaves Hanover Park. And that comes all the way down to leave on the south side here. On the eastern side, there is no direct road that takes you out of Hanover Park. So this is a housing space here, which is closed in. You have to exit if you want to on this side via this highway here. And so in this area, there's 3 or 4 exits in total to leave. Right here is a warehouse district with no through traffic. And here is a park with no through traffic and a mall. So that's just to give you a sense of the scope of what we are talking about when talk about a neighborhood. And within Hanover Park, you'll find 8 or 9 independently functioning gangs taking up parts of this neighborhood, all at different times, going to battle with one another. And that is largely over drugs, or in some cases, strictly a sort of taxi or even extortion fight. But a lot of it is rooted around micro territory battles. They want to have, for example, this set of flats to distribute drugs from and within. And so they may end up in a war between, one of the gang's names is the Mongrels. I'm not sure if somebody wants to translate that, because it's not a polite name for themselves, but they named themselves the Mongrels. And then another big group is the Americans I mentioned earlier. And they have sort of somewhat funny names to us, things like Clever Kids, Fancy Boys, Laughing Boys. Those are some of the names of the gangs that exist in Hanover Park. And so their origin story, which is true for almost every gang we meet, is that they're sort of a group of kids that hung out together in District 6. And when they got moved to Hanover Park, they developed a severe paranoia and territoriality. And they started to end up in conflicts with other kids in the community. And then they would start with these small scale battles. Maybe they would bring pipes to a fight, or, you know, it's the sort of fist, rock, knife, gun story, where it starts as fist fights, moves to low level rock throwing and beating each other up with like rudimental things, to stabbing, and then eventually now gunplay. And we've got a massive spike in violence this year of about 40% in the last quarter against the same quarter last year. And so we're seeing a huge amount of new violence in Hanover Park as an example, and having to deal with a lot of that. And so there's more and more mob violence happening in the community. That would be large groups of youth fighting other large groups of youth. And then the adults in the community started to organize gangs, and then started to pin drug distribution to the gang. So there was a period of time where the gangs were purely just violence actors, robbers, and so on. And then they realized that they shouldn't be protecting these drug distributors, they should be the drug distributors. And around the 80s, they sort of took over the drug game entirely. And so these gangs grew into organized crime and more formalized crime. The Americans, another group, is called the Sexy Boys. I'm sure everybody knows what that means in English. And so what are the social implications on our community as a function of this? The community is now reliant on gangs based on their economy and their organizational structure to the community. They perform some basic social functions. They give out small amounts of money for medicine, for hospital visits. They provide security from other gangs in the community that you may be less familiar with. They create the most jobs and money of any single actor.
Sí.
Pues tenés razón, te queda pendiente el baño.
Por favor, alguien está con el micrófono abierto.
Pues dice que
Por
hoy
favor,
van a dejar el piso.
el departamento de videoconferencias está con el audio abierto.
Hoy, y que eso termina
Por
mañana
favor,
o mañana. O sea, eso lo acaban.
El departamento de... Okay. Go on, Nate, please.
Oh, sorry, I didn't catch that. So I didn't know if it was a question or if there was that just sounds like a background. So there's a lot of controversy in the community about gangs because they're both dominant in the community, but also members of the community. And so a lot of times you'll get a lot of screaming and complaining about gangs, but when it comes to the gangs that those same community members either belong to or have associations with, there's a lot of defense of those particular members. And so there's heavy pressure, as I mentioned earlier, to participate. Everyone knows and is friends with or family members with gang members in the community in some fashion. And the families can be split up and torn up by this because different family members or cousins and others from the neighborhood will be members of different gangs based on where they live, not who their family is all the time. And so we have usually knives and guns in this case, in terms of the sort of violence we see. Whoever has the most guns often has more control in the community. And so oftentimes there's an arms race. The Americans are the largest in this community, but the mongrels are the most dangerous and most feared. They're the ones most likely involved in violence from the start of any conflict. So they're sometimes left alone for large periods to operate as they please. And then there are bosses. There's a large economy associated with it. Drug dealing and illicit markets are all a big part of their economic development. And so conflicts in the community with these sorts of gangs create a large amount of civilian deaths, because the gun fights they involve themselves in are usually not very strategic, not very targeted, often going on in public places and having large shootouts for extended periods of time where 20, 30, 40 bullets are sent back and forth, often with a handgun across 200 or 300 meters. So every night you might hear gunshots. Oftentimes they're just gunshots to send out warnings and let everyone know that they've got guns and that they're willing to use them. It's not always a violence act, but there's just a sort of regular amount of trauma happening in the community around gun violence. And then when they do want to kill somebody specific, they will sort of sneak up and try to shoot at high-level operators or other sort of participants in the gang. And very often, gang members across different gangs will know each other. These communities are very insulated and not that big. So Hanover Park probably has 50 to 60,000 people in it. And so they've grown up together their entire lives, gone to the same schools, competed in the sports together, but are now standing across from each other in gang conflict. And so, apologies for the big zoom out. That can be sometimes very jarring, but that is sort of a deep dive into Hanover Park. I'm going to just kind of explain what government is doing and how they relate to this. So there isn't a lot that government is doing directly about the gangs in Hanover Park. That varies from precinct to precinct in our city. But in this case, they'll engage this issue with the community. The gangs are complicit and sometimes operating some of the community engagement committees. So in our CPF, for example, that is largely a gang-owned space in Hanover Park. Our CPF is the civilian oversight process for our police. And so every neighborhood has a community policing forum, and that is meant to be groups of champions in the community that help create and distribute information about safety. However, in the Hanover Park case, the gangs have kind of taken that over. The SAPS refers to our policing structure, South African Police Service, and they are held in varied esteem. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of distrust between the community and SAPS for various reasons around corruption and service delivery. Some of the stuff I mentioned earlier about the way that the original South African police treated communities like this continues to persist today. It's not very polite. It's not very service oriented. It's not very legitimate. Police all know who the gang leaders are, but there's a very low amount of detective work. So oftentimes the gang leaders have already fought their way through the police, or otherwise the police can't put together a case against them. There was an organization, no longer existing, from America called Ceasefire. It wasn't run by the Americans, but the Americans trained, the United States of America tried to train a group of people in this community to provide mediation and disruption services for the community. That project has since failed, unfortunately, due to many, many varied reasons. And then one of the big things that causes problems is that old leaders are oftentimes sort of released from jail in large numbers because our jails are overcrowded. Sometimes the government will just say, we're going to release everybody who has a drug crime, for example, all at once. And so before this, we were experiencing a quiet period due to gang truces, but that's ended in the last couple of weeks. Gangs are further organizing. Even during these quiet periods, they don't lose membership. So I think we estimate around half of the youth at any given time in the community are a member of these gangs in some way, shape, or form. And when they are quiet, they actually sort of grow more membership because there's a stronger economic development space for them. They're able to sell more drugs, they're able to operate more taxis and so on. And so oftentimes the big reason that they might enter into a truce is based on the economic slowdown that happens during gang wars. And then there's a territory consolidation happening. So every time there's a bit of tension around where the territory is, then there's a little bit of friction, violence, and then when it consolidates, we have a bit of quiet. And then we're getting more and more drugs now. So obviously the sort of global market for drugs is changing with new chemical stuff, with marijuana being legalized, with new drugs on the market, in particular MDMA and things along those lines have become more and more prevalent. We still have a huge meth market, and we still have a lot of heroin. And that is going up and up in the community. So I'm going to pause there and see if I have any immediate questions. I don't want to try to get through too much more without that, unless you think I should go to my last part first. What do you guys think?
I don't know, Ismael, if we have questions from the audience, especially questions regarding understanding. If we can continue, Nate.
All right. I'm going to shift to a new shared window. Tell me if it pops up. Great. So I'm going to move up on this, and I'm just going to say, this is a document that I put together to try to articulate as much of this as I could for policy makers in Cape Town to understand what's going on. I'm not going to read it to you, and I'm not going to go too focused in on this, but there are some helpful charts and a little bit of sort of more articulated explanation of what we see in these gangs here that it might be helpful. And so I've put a small sort of map. This is the entirety of this is the entirety of Cape Town in a gray map there. I'm going to zoom in on that real quick. Sorry. And this just sort of picks out some of these areas. So Mannenberg, for example, and Hanover Park are kind of next to each other. They function with very similar gang types. At that time, we were seeing crews developing in Hanover Park that weren't happening in Mannenberg, for example. Lavender Hill is another one of the Cape Flats down here by what we call False Bay. That's another part of our ocean front. But right here is another neighborhood that is a Cape Flats colored neighborhood that also you'll see street gangs are common and consistent across these Cape Flats areas. Then when you move to the township spaces, which are over here, this one in green and this one in orange, that is Guguletsu and Nyanga. And that's where you see those groups I was talking about, crews and cliques. Cliques are the lesser known groups operating. And so this document tries to articulate the operations in as much sort of, it's generalized, but trying to give it some detail and understanding. And so you'll see I've put together as best I could sort of a, what would we call this? I guess not just a chart, but I guess some tiered structuring around how you might define each of these gangs if you see them. So when you see crews, they don't have any economics. They don't really have a hierarchy. They may have like a organic leader amongst them, but it's not a named leader. They don't have a structure or an operational model, but they do, and they're usually very small, usually 15 to 35 youth, and they participate in sort of a very localized space, high visibility violence, but very low mortality. There's a lot of like flesh wounds, not a lot of murder. Their operation is entirely informal, and their relationships with other agencies and other gangs and everything else is almost non-existent. The community itself won't engage it because they're children in the eyes of the community here, which especially in Black townships means they're not to be talked to by adults. So young men under the age of 18 are largely not spoken to by the adults because it's seen as children, and there's a very specific rite of passage that allows you to be a member of the adult space. So there's very little mentorship and very little intervention happening amongst these youth gangs in Black townships. Now, cliques, that's that group I was talking about earlier. So I'm skipping the mob crew because they're just bigger versions of that. The cliques are that they're a smaller grouping of men in Black townships principally. And they're involved in a large number and array of economic crime and murder. And they are semi-formal in that they have a membership and sometimes names. They're participating in organized crime, but their hierarchy usually is very low and their structures are very low, meaning they don't really have leadership in a way that keeps them organized. And sometimes that's what drives conflict. And so sometimes we'll find gangs that have a lot of internal conflict about distribution of money, causing huge amounts of murder in the community amongst each other. Men in the cliques killing other men in cliques, sometimes their own. And so they're not often that big. They do sometimes collaborate, but they're not often that big of a group. They have low visibility, high mortality violence. So you're very unlikely to see their violence when they kill someone. They are usually targeting people in informal spaces and in late at night. So we have a ton of that goes on in the evening hours of our townships. They are formal, but not organized in the way that I described earlier. And then their relationships, they have a medium amount of relationships. They'll take money from politicians to kill other politicians. They'll take money from organizations to target other organizations. They will sometimes take a lot of the murder for hire that if you look it up in Cape Town, any of our big stories of murder for hire are oftentimes even colored township gangs hiring these cliques to go kill a politician or a lawyer or somebody else. And so we have a lot of violence that we can attribute to them, and they are a group that aren't even acknowledged by the police structures in our country. So then we come to the street gangs. I spent quite a bit of time describing these, so I won't repeat myself, but they fall here into this scale. And so you'll see all of these things we've been talking about now. They've corrupted the police, they've corrupted politicians. A number of our previous presidents are sort of famous for having worked alongside our street gangs or paid them to try to create a bit of disruptions during election periods and so on. And they will sometimes be contracted for various things. And they are ones that sort of are, you'll see here, either organized or highly organized, really focused on operational elements, really focused on sort of relationship management and where they fall within that. And then you've got these other elements of sort of where you see and find them. So we have high visibility, high mortality in the street gangs because they also have those big shootouts I mentioned earlier. They aren't just restricted to the sort of like targeted murder that we get with the cliques and the smaller gangs in the Black township. And they can grow to massive sizes. I should actually say street gangs themselves might be, individual street gangs would probably limit out at 200. But if you take into account the Americans that I mentioned earlier, they grow to thousands upon thousands of members. And so the Americans, as an example, would be sort of tied together by a group of leaders across the city that meet or know each other well and meet to discuss strategy and gun distribution and so on. And so what you see with the prison gang, which is the most famous media-wise, is not really a lot of economics associated with it because they're really restricted to prison. Their hierarchy is sort of a trickier one to discuss because it's all structured around role playing. So there is a hierarchy, but it's more of a structure. And you can like earn your way up in broader rank, but it doesn't necessarily give you a particular role. Their size is massive. It's the entire prison almost. Pretty much anybody in prison ends up becoming one of those three numbers, 25, 26, 27, 28. And 28, they all have their own culture, their own operational roles in the prison and so on. And so what you'll see here is I try my best to kind of work through a couple of pages and definitions in terms of all of these assessments on each of these gang types. And so each gang sort of works in different fashion. I tried my best to sort of create manageable descriptions of what they do here. And this is an example of something I will send on for you guys to consider after our presentation today. So that takes us through the cliques, the economic hierarchy, structure, and so on. And that carries on and on and on in terms of each gang type. So I'm going to, I think, stop for a moment and see what of these sort of issues can I answer. I have a lot of other material that I can talk about, from some of the crime stats that we're seeing now, some of the trends and changes that are going on in our gangs, all the way to other gang maps, which really articulate how the gangs look and operate in our space. So I'm going to stop sharing these documents and come back to you guys. And I'd love to hear what of this is most interesting, or what more can I bring to the table today to better articulate how our gangs are operating and what they do differently than what I see in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Nate. It's been very interesting. I'm going to make a few comments, and then after that, you can expand on some of these issues. And particularly in terms of the comparison that you make between the gangs in Cape Town and the gangs, as you know, operating in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So first, I'd like to introduce the Safety Lab, because...
Oh, I forgot to do that. Sorry, Ignacio.
As I said before, Nate is the director of the Safety Lab. The Safety Lab is a non-governmental organization that deals with violence prevention in Cape Town. It is funded by the state, by the municipality actually. So it's public funding, but it's an independent organization. The idea behind its creation was we need a more flexible organization, independent from the state, to think about strategies to try to bring down violence in the Cape Flats. South Africa is one of the countries with the highest murder rate in the world after Latin America. So if you look at the data, usually you'll see some Latin American countries starting with Central America. So often it'll be El Salvador, Honduras, Venezuela, even though Venezuela doesn't have very reliable figures. Then you may see Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. And then around that range, you will always see South Africa. And within South Africa, the Western Cape, which is the province where Cape Town is located, has also the highest murder rate. So it's an extremely violent area. And as a result, violence and security is one of the main issues in the political and social debate. And it's a very peculiar strategy or trait that they have such a special, first they have a something called DOCS, which stands for, Nate, what's DOCS? How do
that's the Department of Community Safety.
Yeah, the Department of Community Safety. So within the municipality of Cape Town, they have a department which is trying to focus on community safety, which is also a unique trait. And then they have these non-governmental organizations funded by the municipality also to help along that. So it's a very specific and interesting environment. So I think Nate has made a huge effort to try to create a taxonomy of the gangs and in Cape Town. And that also reflects very well on the difficulty of defining gangs. If I remember what Dennis Rogers said in a previous seminar here, he said, I think we should give up on trying to define gangs. He said, gangs can be many different things, and it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what a gang is, and perhaps it's not even needed. That was his position. Whatever your position on this debate, on how or whether we have to define gangs and how we would define them, it's very difficult to do so because they encompass many different realities, and that's why it is so difficult to create such typologies. So Nate's typology, like some others that exist, vary according to size of the groups, the economy versus the symbolic or aspects of the functioning of the gang, and the degree of organization. These are three of the main features along which types of gangs are created. I think it's fascinating the impact, both in South Africa, when I compare South Africa with the gangs that we are researching on, Ismael, Chris, Ascensio, and myself. We are doing research here in Mexico City, in the metropolitan area. And we're doing research on Cholo gangs. Cholo is kind of a cultural definition for groups of Mexicans that live in the US. So there is a strong cultural component in their identity as a gang. They were created in the US to try to resist, let's call it cultural oppression. So they're in a kind of a hostile environment. They're a minority, they're an ethnic minority, and they create these groups to try to protect themselves and project their identities in a more positive way. So even though it's different from the case of Cape Town, in Cape Town, the cultural and political components of gangs are very, very strong. As Nate was explaining, the gangs are absolutely articulated according to ethnic limits. So there are colored gangs and there are black gangs. And you wouldn't see a black person in a colored gang or vice versa, because the divide, the cleavage is absolutely strong. And they also represent their communities, and they have their own language. So again, the cultural and political components in both sides are very, very strong. Also, in the case of Cape Town, it's very interesting, as Nate explained, the incorporation of foreign cultural elements to define themselves. So the Americans, why on earth would colored South Africans define themselves as the Americans? And some of them even created their identities and their names according to films that were projected, American US films, Hollywood films that were projected in the 50s or 60s, created an identity for a local gang. So it is also fascinating how foreign components can be incorporated, even colonial components, as Nate was saying. So they have allegiance to a flag, and the flag is a US flag versus a British flag. So we're talking about South Africa. But then again, there are imported cultural elements that make part of their cultural identity. And in the case of our Cholo gangs in Mexico City, most of the people we have interviewed have not lived in the US, and therefore need of cultural protection versus a hostile environment, which was at the origin of the creation of these gangs in the US. So many of the people we interviewed have never been to the US, have never been through that. Still, they have incorporated these cultural component, cultural identity. In both cases, we have a question of pride, identity, and mutual support as basic components of a gang. There's also a very clear element of branding. So the gang is a lot about its name. So people will define a flag, a name, and branding is a crucial component in both sides. And again, I think that's very interesting. And when we ask them, well, why do you fight? Or they say, we have to defend the barrio, the neighborhood. The neighborhood is not really a neighborhood, it's themselves. It's the cacos or whatever it is their name is. So name, flag, and identity are crucial, and that will manifest itself into tattoos. We also have face tattoos, which again lead these people who have these tattoos into a very clear position vis-a-vis the rest of society, because they're clearly identified, and it's a mark that is very hard to remove. So in South Africa, I don't think Nathan mentioned it, but for example, one of the projects they have in the safety lab is a project of a place where you can go and remove your tattoos, because removing your tattoos is the only chance you have of actually not being seen as a member of the gangs by the rest of society. In both cases, we also have degraded urban habitats. So you can see it very clearly. The areas where these people live are dilapidated, degraded. That's part of the reaction. So there is an attempt to create a positive identity out of a situation that will probably yield negative identities for local youth. And they're desperately trying to form a positive identity through the means of a gang. Another similarity that I find between Cape Town and Mexico is what we can call the paradox of protection, which is that many people both in Mexico and Cape Town will tell you that they join the gang for protection, for individual protection or for protection of their community versus other groups. But in reality, joining the gang represents a very high risk. So even though they generally perceive joining the gang as an act of self-protection, in reality, they're placing themselves at a high risk. And this is a paradox can be seen in both situations. Another similarity is this idea of inter-gang violence, almost to a ritualized point. So if you want to be a Caco, you have to fight the other gangs, and you have to be an Americans, you have to fight the mongrels, because otherwise, what's the point of being an American if you don't find the mongrels or vice versa? And the same applies here. So there's a lot of ritualized violence, which is essential for the very definition of the gang. If the gang doesn't fight other gangs, then its own identity may be compromised. A difference between Cape Town and Mexico is the degree in which these gangs apply social functions or social assistance. If we compare this to situations of other groups, for example, in Brazil, where they also give out a lot of public services to the communities. In areas where the state is pretty much absent, these gangs in Brazil, for example, will give toys to the children at Christmas, will organize parties, will pay for burials, will pay for medicines for people who are sick. And some of these functions were described also by Nate. In the case of Mexico, our gangs are not so organized and they do not perform these social functions. And as a result, their relationship with the community is different because they're not really good for the communities. They're not doing nice things for the community, and the community may fear them or tolerate them, but they don't have a clear benefit as they do in places like Cape Town and Brazil. And the last point I would like to point out is the lack of detective work that Nate was mentioning for Cape Town. Again, the same happens in Mexico. So how is it possible that when you go and interview these gangs, you learn a lot about them and you know more about them than the police does? So you would think that if they had a strong investigative unit, it would be relatively simple to get evidence and to arrest people who commit crimes within the gangs, because it's a very public knowledge, and gang members will tell you about the things they do. But that doesn't happen simply because, well, there's a lot of corruption, of course, in both countries, but behind or beyond the corruption, there is not a clear detective investigative work by the police that would allow them to know what's going on and would allow them to act swiftly. In the case of Mexico, because of the drug groups being more threatening for the government, the police concentrate on drug dealers and drug groups, which also have a strong relationship with the gangs, and some of the members of the gangs have confessed to us that they do participate in drug dealing, but they don't do that as members of the gangs, so they are co-opted individually. So the police and the government focus on drug dealers when they do at all, and they sort of kind of forget about the gangs as a minor problem, as a lesser evil, and they have very little knowledge of what's going on within the gangs. As far as we know, very little intelligence on the gangs, and therefore very little capacity to act. So I think it's a very interesting comparison that we can draw between the situation in Cape Town and in Latin America. And I would like to ask Nate to expand more on the differences he has seen between the gangs in Cape Town and the gangs in other parts of the world where he has worked, like mainly Chicago and the US and some areas in Latin America.
Yeah. So happily, I'll actually, if you don't mind, I'll cover just a couple quick things. Thank you so much for introducing the company, Ignacio. I apologize. And one of the things that he raised is we spend a lot of time on the ground in communities building community responses. That might be advising community agencies, building projects that are meant to be attractive to sometimes violence actors and sometimes victims, but to create safe social programs around that. And one of them was a sort of coffee shop, tattoo parlor, training academy / community space. And that was designed to try to give alternative economic development to members in the community, while also helping people create that nominal and visible transformation away from gangs, right? And I just wanted to comment as well really quickly on the definition of gangs. And I agree with your previous speaker. I didn't catch the name. I think like getting involved in the sort of hyper definition of gangs isn't really helpful to us. The taxonomy, so to speak, that I've worked on here was intended to principally help communities, help them identify what kind of opportunities for intervention they might be seeing in their space. So if you've got a gang highly organized around economy in your space, then you need to have an economic element to an intervention in order to get youth away from that as a driving factor. If you're seeing mostly territory and sort of interpersonal conflict as the crisis, then the ideal might be to build youth programs that help structure youth belonging in a different way, right? So I do agree, though, that trying to define gangs as like a sort of operational element, or they must have a name, or these other things, is a bit difficult and impossible. And in the evolution of it, it changes every day. I know that the new American think tanks are referring them now just as groups. They don't really even attribute gangs as a title anymore. Certainly you'll see gangs discussed and in the policing structures, but the sort of university-based crime and violence researchers are now starting to refer to them just as groups, because it can take any different format of a group. And if a group is participating in crime and violence, then that's a concern, right? So to your question, and thank you for raising all of those similarities and differences with some of the South American and Central American gangs. I think they're really important, in particular for you guys and your understanding. So our townships are probably most closely like the favelas in Brazil, as an example. Pretty informal, pretty much left to their devices for some time, but didn't experience the amount of community structure development that those favelas experienced. But when comparing these to the famous gangs that they tried to replicate, the gangs of Chicago or of LA, some of the major differences are that they're far more violent than our gangs are. So to draw some of those comparisons for you guys, the most violent city in Mexico last year was Tijuana, I believe. And Tijuana experienced about 2,100 murders for the roughly 2 million people in it. Or they actually, sorry, let me revert. Last year they had a downtick, so it was about 1,900 murders for their 2.1 million. If we take a grouping of our townships in Cape Flats, we did this the other day with our new crime stats, we can put together a grouping of areas that would have experienced a higher rate of murder than Tijuana, right? If we take about 15 of our different neighborhoods and group them together, we get to 2.1 million, and we had 2.2 thousand murders amongst those areas last year. So about 300 more than Tijuana had for the same population. And so we're kind of experiencing also a resurgence in violence and crime. But when I speak to those gangs as an American, right, they want to talk to me about American life and what it's like in those cities. They're amazed when I tell them that we have to add up our 10 most violent cities to get anywhere close to Cape Town's murder rate. Effectively, that accounts for close to 30 million, about 15, America's most violent cities have about 15% of the murder rate of Cape Town. And those gangs don't know that because of the way America sensationalizes its violence, the way that it advertises and promotes it in some ways, the way that our music industry has really sort of put it at the forefront of our rap and hip hop cultures. And so South Africans believe that Americans are more violent and more of the American gangs operate and control things than they do. Membership in a gang in the cities that I've worked in has not been mandatory. There was an era maybe in the 90s where that would have felt mandatory, but in the last 20 years, membership in a gang is not something you have to do in American cities. It's something that might be available to you. It might be a pathway you get on for various reasons, whether that's home life or destitution or drug addiction or money, but it isn't something that is a mandatory participation thing like it is here in Cape Town. And so because of that, you actually have a bit of a different accessibility. Like you were saying, Ignacio, when I got here, I came here alone. I wasn't sponsored. I did have a small grant from my university, but there was no one from Georgetown that was here to support me in any way. And no organization could get me into a room with gangs. None of the NGOs I could find could put me in a room with a current gang member to meet and understand it. So I just started going to the gangs that I would see in the streets and trying to engage them in conversations. You might say that's stupid, and I think I knew it was stupid at the time, but it ended up making me quite famous amongst the gangs in this town as somebody who was just going to come and talk to them about their operations and express some degree of concern and consideration for them as humans, because that's not often happening in the course of their operational day. And because there's so many of them, they don't really, and to your point about police, they don't fear risk of prosecution here, broadly speaking. If you get caught as a gang member, you're pretty surprised. And so the violence that occurs, people expect to do that without any recourse. And that means that they're very free with explaining themselves and talking to people that demonstrate themselves in any way other than police. They'll tell you why they do what they do. They may not tell you their specific crimes or murders, but they will tell you quite openly what kind of crimes and murders they're engaged in and their gang participates in. And then they'll tell you a lot of myths. They'll tell you stories about how much more important they are than everyone else. But that's to be expected in this kind of an ego battle around who's the most powerful, who's the coolest of the gangs. So the big difference that I experience is one, way more prevalent here. Just gang membership across the board is far more prevalent here than it is in the United States gangs. The iconography is more in your face. The sort of taking iconography from America is very strange because American gangs aren't going to put American flags on their material. In many ways, they identify themselves as countercultural. And so here, it's, you know, those kind of things are different, although you could say them choosing the American flag is countercultural to South Africa, right? And so all of that sort of like dominance of belonging. So when I compared that to like the favelas I've spent time in Brazil, where gangs would run the neighborhood in some ways, but they wouldn't really have massive groups of members because they're very sort of organized. At least that was true in some of the cases I looked at. Where in Hanover Park, you know, half of the youth in the community are a member. In Guguletu, that Black Township space that I mentioned earlier, it was very hard for me to find a young male that wasn't associated with one of the crews. And if they were, they probably weren't out in the street for obvious reasons, but that was the only way people could like join the soccer team or go out and hang out with their friends at night. And so there was just a membership orientation around that. And that is not true in the United States. In the United States, if you're a member of a gang, you know, you've got duties. You have obligations to certain types of behavior and crime. And you're definitely not going to talk to some white dude from a research space about your day-to-day operations, unless there's a long courtship process of relationship building. Sorry, we have load shedding going here, so we just have lights turning on and off. And so those are the biggest differences I see. You know, the American gangs are, the different cities have different gangs. I don't know if anybody's spoken to you about that, different structures of gangs. So in like LA, you would see big areas of LA run by one gang, where in Chicago, it's a lot smaller neighborhoods with many different gangs. And in New York, that's even more micro developed. It's even sort of like neighborhood based crews and so on. And so that was kind of what I was looking at when I decided to try to create a version of stratification, like the spectrum of gangs in Cape Town, is that I saw little bits from all the different cities I had spent time in and all the other research I'd done, from youth gangs through to sort of like neighborhood gangs, through to the bigger syndicated sort of Bloods and Crips that everyone used to speak about. And lastly, in America, although face tattoos have become quite popular, there's no sort of like face tattoo design style that belongs to a certain gang, American gang. I mean, we had MS-13, we had Calle 18. So we saw some of that happening in our country. And I will just comment, because the gang tattoos I showed you weren't really well articulated. Our tattoo work is much, although this is good and bad in different ways, is much more, it's not as artistic as I would say the gang tattoos of Mexico or El Salvador are. It's a very rudimental process, at times involving burnt tar and bone used to make those tattoos in prison, but more often than not, pens that have been sharpened, plastic sort of Bic pens. I don't know if you guys have those everywhere else, that they'll sharpen and then dip into certain types of stain and dye and ink, and then just sort of needle point their way through that, which sometimes causes other health problems. And that's part of the reason we took on that tattoo element. So to try to boil it down really quickly, gangs in America are far more aware that they are kind of at risk of being pursued by police, of having some sort of conflict with each other or outsiders in general, very much more paranoid than gangs are here. The gangs here are more paranoid about each other and not as paranoid about the public or even police, because the police, to your point, the detective work is so rare that people assume they're going to be able to get away with shootings and murder. And if they do get caught, it's not a big problem, because eventually they can buy their way out of that evidence and then be released from prison back to the community in a matter of months. And that obviously reduces the legitimacy of the police and the justice system in our country here in South Africa. And because people see the murderer of their child or of their friend or brother out in the streets sometimes the next day, there's really no faith in the system. And the community's kind of turned against any kind of engagement with government about policing gangs, because they're not protected. They see the system as ineffective. And even if they gave all of the evidence over, then they're afraid they would then be a target of a gang.
Thank you, Nathaniel. We have a few minutes and we received one question of the broadcast chat. Karen asks, are there any actions that have been taken by the authorities to control prison gangs in South Africa in recent years?
In recent years, they passed a organized crime act that allows them to prosecute multiple members of gangs at the same time for one crime, which has helped. It's similar to the American, I'm not sure if they've got it in Central America or otherwise, but that allows, to prosecute groups of people as racketeers, is what we call them in America, but meaning if you're a member of a group that participates in a crime, all members of the group can be held accountable if they have the evidence to associate you in that group. And so that has helped a little bit. But something we didn't mention, for example, we have huge amounts of police corruption in this. So one of the biggest gun distributors in our country over the last decade was the police. So they would, not only do they have hand-to-hand redistribution in the community itself for like $1,000 that you can get your gun you killed somebody with back from a police officer. So you can ditch the gun so that you're not caught with it. And then once they collect it, you can get it back. But on top of that, the central office for our national police, and I should have mentioned this, we only have a national crime force. So it is operated from a central office in a city far away from here, and they make decisions top down. So we only have federal police. And those where they used to send any confiscated guns, instead of being destroyed, were just sent back to the gangs, in particular in Cape Town, for small amounts of money. And so as much as they are doing a little bit of a better job on the prosecution side, there's so few there's so few detectives working on that. And they have so many political battles inside our police that they end up firing half of the police that try to do anything about it. In addition to that, they're so corrupt that, you see all these movies about the sort of expectation of corruption in the police force. That's very true here. If you don't show yourself to be willing to participate in corruption, then you're probably going to get pushed out. And lastly, they are all paid badly enough that they are all willing to engage in this sort of corruption game of either selling evidence, selling back information, selling back actual murder weapons to gangsters on a day-to-day basis. We're not seeing any serious prosecutions happening in this town.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Ignacio. And thanks to all the people who had followed the broadcast. Now, finally, I will give the floor to Ignacio so that he can close the session and the seminar. Please, Ignacio, go ahead.
Thank you, Ismael. And thanks everybody who's watching and participating on this. It's been a very great series of seminars that we've had. We've had sessions on Mexico, sessions on Central America, Nicaragua, on El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and now a session in South Africa. So I think it's been very instigating, and the question still remains, to what degree are these gangs similar or different in different environments, and why? And after that, of course, the question is, what can we do to diminish the level of violence involved in these gang operations in different countries? So we thank especially Nate, who's been with us. It's very late in South Africa now. You can see it's dark behind him. So thank you very much for your participation and for your presentation.
Thank you all. It's an honor.